A deaf bride sat alone on the wrong platform for 5 nights. A rancher learned to sign. The station master came to find me on a Wednesday, which was already a bad sign. Dillard Hoops never left his window if he could help it. He ate his lunch hunched over the telegraph key and pissed in a tin can he kept behind the mail sack. So the sight of him walking up my front path in the late afternoon with his hat turning in his hands meant something had gone sideways somewhere. I was splitting rails. I kept splitting them while he talked. He said there was a woman. Said she'd been sitting on the bench outside the east platform, the freight platform, the wrong one, for going on 5 days. Said she came in on the Denver line Monday before last and hadn't moved except to sleep on that bench at night. Said she wasn't right in the head, maybe, because you could talk to her and she wouldn't answer, just look at you with those eyes. I set them all down. He said she had a letter, folded up in her coat pocket. He'd read it, figured he had cause, and it had my name on it. I didn't say anything for a while. A crow was working at something dead out past the fence line, and I watched it. "Whose name?" I said finally. "Yours," he said. "Calvin Drury. Says Calvin Drury, Millhaven Station, Nebraska Territory." I told him I didn't know any woman coming to me on the Denver line. He said I'd better come look at the letter. So I went. I need to back up some because this doesn't make sense without the winter before it, and the winter before that doesn't make sense without Margaret. Margaret died in the February of '71. Fever took her in 4 days. We had 7 years together and no children, and I never once told her in plain words that she was the reason I kept getting up in the mornings, which is a thing I've had to live with. After she was gone, I ran the ranch alone, kept my head down, worked until I couldn't think anymore, and then slept and then got up and worked again. Harlan Voss, who sold feed in town and was closer to a friend than anyone else I had, started talking to me about 2 years after Margaret about the correspondence agencies. He wasn't pushy about it. He just mentioned it, then let it alone. Mentioned it again the next spring. Said there were women out east who wanted a different life. Said some of them were educated. Said it was just letters to start, no obligation. I wrote away for information, and then let the pamphlet sit on the kitchen table for 6 weeks before I read it. I wrote a letter in November of '73. I told the truth in it near as I could. I was 44. I had a working cattle ranch, 300 and some acres, a house that needed work but kept out the cold. I was not a warm man by nature. I had been married and my wife had died, and I was not looking to replace her exactly, but I was tired of the silence in the evenings, and I thought a person could learn to be useful to another person even if the feeling didn't come natural to start. The agency wrote back, said they had a woman named Clara Veitch, 31, schoolteacher from Ohio, who had expressed interest in Western relocation. Said she was quiet, industrious. They said she had a particular circumstance I should know about before proceeding. She was deaf, had been since a fever at age 9. I sat with that for about a week. I don't know what I expected to feel. What I felt, mostly, was that it didn't change the arithmetic much. A person was a person. If she was willing to come out to a place like this knowing what it was, she had a kind of nerve I respected already. I wrote and said I was still interested. We corresponded for 8 months. She wrote in a clear hand, longer letters than I sent, and she didn't waste words on pleasantry. She asked direct questions. She wanted to know the water situation, the nearest town with a doctor, whether I kept help on in winter or worked alone. I answered everything straight. She told me she'd been teaching at a school in Dayton. Said the children were fine but the parents weren't always, and that she'd been thinking about a change for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She said she understood this was a practical arrangement to start, and that she was not a woman who required being treated like glass. That last line I read twice. We agreed on March. I sent train fare. I told her, Denver line into Millhaven, West Platform, I'll be there. I don't know how I wrote West Platform when I meant East. I went over it in my head about 1,000 times later. I can only figure I wrote what I was used to writing. I picked up freight on the West Platform every Thursday and didn't think it twice. Just the West Platform because that's the platform I knew. She came in on the Denver line, Monday, March 2nd. I wasn't there. I didn't know she'd arrived. I was waiting on the East Platform Thursday, the freight day, thinking I had missed her somehow, that something had happened on the rail line, that she had changed her mind. I walked through the station 3 times. Asked Dillard Hoops, who was in his cage behind the window, whether the Denver line had come in on time on Monday. He said it had. I said, did any woman come off it alone? He shrugged and said he didn't track passengers. I went home and sat at the table until it got dark. Friday, I sent a telegram to the agency in Ohio. Got no answer until Sunday, which said only that Miss Veitch had departed as scheduled. By that point, she'd been on the wrong bench for 6 days. She was sitting there when Dillard came to get me. Small, dark coat, good quality but old. A valise at her feet and a hat bag on top of it, and her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a church service to begin. She was watching the freight wagons being loaded from the other side of the yard, with an expression I couldn't read from a distance. I walked up and she saw me coming, and her eyes moved to my face and stayed there. I said, Miss Veitch. She couldn't hear me say it. But she read it off my mouth somehow, or she knew who I had to be, because she reached into her coat and took out the folded letter and held it out to me. Not to give it, just to show. Like, here is the document. Here is the evidence. Here is my claim. I took off my hat. I don't know why I did that. I hadn't planned to. It just seemed like the right thing. A man takes his hat off when he's in the wrong, and I was entirely in the wrong. She looked at me a long moment, then she picked up her valise. She had eaten from the station kitchen, I found out later. The cook, a Mexican woman named Lupe who fed the freight workers, had figured out pretty quick that the woman on the bench couldn't hear and had just started bringing her a plate at mealtimes. No charge. She wouldn't take money for it when I tried to settle up later. She said the woman had helped her carry in flour sacks one afternoon when she saw Lupe struggling with them. Said she was a worker. Said it like that was the final word on the subject, which I supposed it was. The ride back to the ranch was about 4 miles. I'd brought the wagon. Clara sat on the bench seat beside me and watched the country go by, and I watched the road and didn't say anything because I couldn't figure how to say it. The apology I'd been rehearsing in my head since Dillard's visit about the platform, the letter, the days she'd sat there, felt thin now that she was next to me in the actual world. I kept starting it in my head and it kept coming out wrong. About 2 miles out, she tapped my arm. I looked at her. She made a gesture I didn't understand, both hands, an open shape, then pointed at the horizon ahead. I shook my head. She thought a moment. Then she pointed at the land around us, the grass, the sky, the road cutting through, raised her eyebrows, a question. It goes about 320 acres, I said. This is the east edge. She watched my mouth. Then she nodded once slowly and looked back at the country around us. I thought about that nod for days afterward. There was something in it that wasn't quite approval, more like, noted. This is the situation, good. The house was a 2-room arrangement when she arrived. I'd built on a 3rd room 2 years prior, and it was finished but mostly storage. I'd cleaned it out in February anticipating her arrival, put in a proper bed and a washstand, and a chest of drawers I'd bought from Soren Eklund's widow when she moved to her daughter's place in Kearney. It wasn't much, but it was private and the south window got good light. She went through the house that first evening the way she'd looked at the land on the wagon, methodical, taking things in without expression. Checked the kitchen pump, opened the stove and looked at the firebox, went out to the water trough and tested the fill pipe, came back inside and looked at the larder. It was thin. I'd been living on salt pork and dried beans for the better part of a month. She found a pencil on the kitchen shelf and wrote on a square of paper she took from her coat pocket. I will need flour, cornmeal, dried apples, lard, salt cod if you can get it. I said I could get all of that in town. She wrote tomorrow. I said yes. She wrote good. That was the whole of our first conversation. I need to say something about what those first weeks were and weren't. It was not a warm or easy thing. We were strangers with an agreement between us and very little else, and the fact that we couldn't speak in any ordinary way made the strangeness sit heavier. I didn't know how to talk to her without the paper and pencil, and the paper and pencil felt slow and formal in a way that reminded me every time that I'd made things hard. She was patient with it. But I could see her watching me sometimes, just watching, that steady look, and I didn't know what she was reading in my face. What I knew was that she worked. She worked the way people work when they've done it all their lives and find a kind of steadiness in it. Up before me most mornings. The kitchen already warm when I came in, coffee on. She put in a kitchen garden by the end of the third week, starting with the cold hardy things, peas and turnips and a row of onions, in ground I hadn't turned in years. She patched the window sash in the bedroom that had let cold air in since the second winter. Found a box of my good harness in the barn that had been sitting in too much moisture and cleaned, and oiled every piece of it without being asked. I started watching for things that needed doing and getting to them before she could, partly because it seemed right that I should carry my end, partly because I liked that she noticed. We managed with notes and with gestures mostly. She was fast at reading lips, uncannily fast, and I caught myself talking more plainly and straight on because I wanted her to catch it all. She had a dry sense of what was funny, which surprised me. I wrote something once about one of the horses, old Purvis, who had a habit of trying to untie himself from the hitching rail and had gotten loose again and ended up in Harlan Voss's yard. She read the note and the side of her mouth came up just a little. Just a little, but it was there. I'd been on the land 11 years by then, and I couldn't remember the last time something I said had made anybody smile. It was Harlan who told me about the hand language. He came out for supper in April. Clara had by then taken full command of the kitchen and the meals had changed considerably. And afterward, sitting on the porch, he mentioned that he'd read about it in a newspaper. Said there was a whole system of it. Said there were people in the East who used it natural as speech. I said I'd heard of that. He said there was a teacher in Omaha, a woman who ran a school for the deaf. Said she'd taught a course once at the normal school in Lincoln for regular people who worked with deaf folks. I told him Clara and I were getting along fine. He looked at me. Didn't say anything, just looked. I said, "What?" He said, "Calvin, the woman wrote you 112 letters and came 3 days on a train and sat alone for a week on the wrong bench waiting for you to come. I'm just mentioning there's a course." He let it alone after that. I thought about it for about 3 weeks before I did anything. What stopped me wasn't that I was against it. It was something else, harder to name. Something that felt like, if I go learn this thing, I am saying out loud that I intend to stay. That this is not just an arrangement on paper, that she is not just a woman I sent for and feel obligated to. And once I said that out loud in whatever form, I couldn't unsay it. She found me one evening at the kitchen table with a piece of paper. I'd written out the alphabet, the regular one, and I was trying to remember what I'd seen once in a pamphlet about letters made with the hand. I had the A and the B right, I thought. The rest I was guessing at. She sat down across from me, looked at the paper, looked at me. Then she reached across and moved my hand into the right shape for C. Just like that, no expression on her face, just "this is how it goes." I made the C. She moved to D. We went through the whole alphabet that way, right there at the kitchen table with the lamp between us. She corrected me when I was wrong, which was often. She didn't make anything of it either way. When we got to Z, she looked at me for a moment and then something changed in her face. Not a smile exactly, more like a softening around the eyes, and she held up one finger. Then she spelled something into the air between us. "SDAY. I looked at her hands, then at her. She waited. I didn't know what she was asking, whether she was asking me something or telling me something, whether it was a question or a statement, stay, whether she was saying she would, whether she was asking if she should. I reached across and took her hand and held it on the table. She let me. We sat like that for a while with the lamp burning low and the night coming in through the window, and I didn't say anything, and she didn't write anything, and that was the most we'd communicated in 2 months. I went to Lincoln in June. Left on a Tuesday, came back Friday. The teacher's name was Mrs. Ethel Moorhead, and she had been deaf herself since birth and had learned to sign from a school in Hartford, Connecticut. She was not what I expected. She was about 50, sharp-eyed, and she looked at me across the table that first morning and said, in plain spoken words, clipped and careful, "Why are you here?" I said I had a deaf wife, and I wanted to talk to her. Mrs. Moorhead said, "Is that the only reason?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at the window. Somewhere outside 2 men were arguing about the price of something. I said, "No, ma'am, it ain't the only reason." She nodded once, like that was the answer she'd been waiting for, and opened the instruction book. I was a bad student for the first day and a half. My hands are big and stiff and the shapes didn't come natural. There were 6 of us in the class, a minister, a school teacher, a mother with a deaf son, a man who ran a boarding house, me, and a young woman about 20 who I never figured out the reason for, and the others were faster at it than I was. Mrs. Moorhead came to me twice the first afternoon and corrected the same sign 3 times running. I could see she was deciding something about me. That evening I sat in the boarding house with the instruction book and practiced until my hands cramped. Got up and made coffee and practiced some more. I went through the verb form she'd given us, and I went through the numbers, and I went through the color words because I thought for some reason that those would matter. I don't know why I thought that. Something about wanting to be able to say, the sky is that color, the grass is that color, look at that. By Thursday I was keeping pace. Mrs. Moorhead pulled me aside on Thursday afternoon and said, "Your wife is lucky." I said I didn't know about that. She said, "Most of them don't come." I thought about that on the whole train ride home. Clara was in the garden when I came up the road. She saw the wagon and straightened and shielded her eyes against the sun and watched me pull in. I tied up Purvis and walked to the garden fence, and she walked to the other side of it, and we stood there with the wire between us. I signed, "I learned some things." She went very still. I signed, "I'm slow, I have to think before each one, but I'm going to keep going." She looked at my hands, then at my face. Her expression was doing something I hadn't seen on it before and couldn't quite name, something that was working to hold itself even. I signed, "I should have done it sooner. I'm sorry it took me this long." She shook her head once, not accepting the apology, not refusing it, more like, "That's not the point of this." She signed back to me. I caught about half of it. She was faster than I could follow yet, but I caught "here" and "good." And one sign I didn't recognize, which she showed me again slower, and which I looked up in the book that night and found meant enough. As in, this is enough. As in, what is here is sufficient. I reached across the fence wire, and she let me take her face in both hands for a moment. Just a moment. She put her hand over one of mine and held it there against her cheek, and we stayed like that in the afternoon light with the garden around her and the ranch around us and the whole quiet country running out past us in every direction. I was not a man who had expected much from his second half. I had been wrong about that too, it turned out. I'm going to tell you what the ranch looked like that fall because I think about it sometimes, and it seems like the right place to end. October. We'd brought in a decent enough hay yield, and the beef prices held, and I'd finally gotten the north pasture fence the way it needed to be. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and some of them had started dropping already, the leaves coming down in that slow, unhurried way they have, and in the morning the whole bottom of the creek draw smelled like cold water and turned leaves. Clara had learned the land the way she'd learned everything else, steady and thorough, on her own terms. She knew which of the horses were trustworthy and which weren't. She'd started picking up some of what I signed before I finished it, the way you do with someone you've been around long enough. I'd started doing the same with her, understanding from context and from the shape of a thing before the individual words resolved. There are things I can say to her now that I couldn't figure how to put in a letter, things that don't have a simple word for them. The hand language has signs for things I wouldn't have known how to say in plain speech either. I told her once, fumbling through it, taking 3 tries to get the signs right. I didn't know I was going to feel this way. I didn't plan it. She signed back, I know, I could tell. And then after a pause, me too. That was in September. I don't make hay about it. That's not how either of us are, but I know what I've got. I know what it cost her to come out here to that bench, to wait on a stranger who had the wrong platform on a letter and didn't show. I know what she chose when she stayed. I know it was a choice. She had the means to leave and she didn't, and that means something that I don't have good words for in any language. What I have instead is a picture in my head. Her standing at the kitchen window in the mornings, watching the light come up over the east pasture, coffee cup in both hands. I come in from the cold and she hears the door by the draft of air it brings and she turns, and whatever was in her face before, quiet, somewhere else shifts when she sees it's me. That shift. That's the thing. A man can go a long time without being seen. A long time thinking the best of him is already behind him, that there's nothing left to offer a person that would matter. I went more years than I want to count feeling like I was just serving out the remainder of what was left. She looked at me across a station yard in March, a woman who had every cause to be done with me before we started, and she picked up her valise. I've been learning her language ever since. I don't know that I'll ever be fast. I don't know that it matters. She understands me, and I understand her well enough now that she doesn't have to wait for me to catch up before she says the next thing. That's something I didn't know I was missing until it was there. The cottonwood leaves are coming down, the cattle are settled, the fence holds. She's at the window right now, watching the light.